Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Potomac Watch podcast, and we're talking with Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel. The former president of the United States responded to his indictment. Let's listen to him on Saturday.
In this whole fake indictment, they don't even once mention the Presidential Records Act, which is really the ruling act, which this case falls under 100%, because they want to use something called the Espionage Act. Doesn't that sound terrible? Oh, espionage. We got a box. I got a box. The Espionage. The Espionage Act of 1917. I think it was put in there about World War I boxes. And by the way, Biden's got 1,850 boxes. He's got boxes in Chinatown, D.C. He's got boxes all over the place. He doesn't know what the hell to do with them. And he's fighting them on the boxes. He doesn't want to give the boxes. And then they say, Trump is obstructioning. He's obstructing. No, it's a sad day for the country.
Well, there we go. Vintage Donald Trump. Reasonable legal points in there with some not so reasonable. There's no evidence, in fact, that Biden has been not returning the documents once they were discovered. There is some evidence that the Justice Department was slow in disclosing that they knew the documents were in Biden's possession, but not that he has failed to turn them over. Kyle, this suggests to me that the former president, President Trump, his lawyers are going to fight this in court, but he's going to fight this in the court of public opinion and portray himself as a victim, and he's going to use it to try to get an advantage in the presidential election campaign.
One thing I would add on the Biden documents, I agree with you that I haven't seen any evidence that they've resisted any attempts to turn those over. But when President Biden was asked about this several months ago, he did not sound particularly apologetic. He said, quote, "My Corvette's in a locked garage, okay? So it's not like they're sitting out on the street."
A locked garage. Mine isn't exactly a secure location.
Not a skiff exactly, but that's the kind of thing that you can imagine President Trump saying about the storage unit or whatever at Mar-a-Lago. And so I do think that the strongest political argument he has is this perceived double standard. And there's a special counsel, Robert Hur, who's been appointed to investigate the Biden documents. And so presumably we will know more at some point about how they came to be there, whether they were packed by staffers and put there without the president's direct knowledge. That appears to be what happened with the documents that were found in Mike Pence's house. His staff said that he did not know that they were there. And so that has now been closed by investigators. But the Hillary Clinton example, I think, to me, is the most direct and most difficult comparison, because even by FBI Director James Comey's admission when he was explaining that he didn't think this would be chargeable, she was extremely careless. There is suggestions or suspicions that maybe foreign adversaries could have hacked that server in her basement because it was not getting the kind of tech support, even of a commercial email platform like Gmail, to say nothing of a regular secure government server. The problem, though, that I think the president has is that is not a legal argument. That is not an argument you can really make to a jury. That is a political argument. And I do think that there's some strength to those political arguments and the wisdom of the path that we're now going down. I would also note an op-ed in Politico by a former federal prosecutor who says that if President Trump wants to push this trial past the November election, it would not be hard for him to do so. He says that this is a case involving classified information, and so lawyers have to get clearances in order to discuss it, that there are all sorts of tactics. There are interlocutory appeals that are available to both sides here, so appeals before the trial happens. And then there's also things like defendants can fire their attorneys right before a trial and then say they need to get new attorneys. And as it happens, last week when the indictment came down, President Trump, his two main attorneys said they were leaving the case and he's getting new attorneys. And so you could really have a situation where President Trump is nominated by the Republican Party, and we go into the November election, and what is on the ballot is whether he is going to be elected president and maybe have the opportunity to appoint a new attorney general who takes a different view of the Presidential Records Act.
Do you think?
Or maybe attempt history's first self-pardon of a president. I mean, what a spectacle that would be.
Well, the whole thing is already an enormous spectacle. A couple of points to add to yours, Kyle. Judge Mukasey agrees with you on Secretary of State Clinton, that in fact she should probably have been indicted based on the facts in that case. He says that the Biden case is enough different to Trump's that he's not as much worried about that as a double standard. As a legal matter, as a political matter, it may in fact be a different story. Kim, when it comes to this indictment, what really concerns me more than anything is the precedent that this opens up for prosecuting a former president and indeed the leading political opponent of the sitting president. Merrick Garland appointed Jack Smith as special counsel, I think, to give him a certain amount of political cover and say, oh, this is Jack Smith's decision. But in truth, it's Merrick Garland's responsibility. The special counsel reports to him. He's not truly an independent counsel in the way that the old independent counsel statute going back to the Nixon days was independent. Smith had to alert Garland of what he was going to do. Garland, he might have said, look, you do what you want. But if he did, he was abdicating his responsibility as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States to approve that indictment. And who does Merrick Garland report to? President Biden. I don't think they can dodge political responsibility for this indictment, and I don't think that the American people are going to think otherwise. They're not going to think, oh, this Elliot Ness of a prosecutor, Jack Smith, is the only guy who had anything to say about it. And what bothers me is this is a big belly flop into the presidential election of 2024. I mean, as Kyle suggested, this could, if Trump gets the nomination, be the biggest issue of the campaign. Is, what is Donald Trump's legal and political future? So we might have a debate only about Donald Trump, a referendum on Donald Trump and the charges against him, and not on anything else that we ought to be debating to settle for the future of the next 4 years of the country. Meanwhile, as well, this complicates things enormously in the primaries for the Republican opponents running against Trump. It makes their ability to criticize Trump more difficult. And I think that it helps Trump probably. You can't say for sure of this, but I think at least in the initial instance, this is going to help him in the primaries, even if it would ultimately hurt him in the general election.
Yeah, this is my problem with the prosecution as well. Let's put all of the details in there aside, but there were so many reasons when we talk about the words prosecutorial discretion for the Department of Justice to use that discretion here. There were other routes that could have been taken short of Jack Smith putting out this indictment. They could have taken a different route before they even got to the special counsel in efforts to obtain these documents. If he were going to have a special counsel, he could have put out a report, something else. Because here's the measure to me, is that if you're going to go down the very unprecedented step of indicting a former president, you better have a case that is so rock solid that you can convince the vast majority of the country that this needed to be brought. And we know that that's not the case. There was a new CBS News poll that was out, conducted by YouGov, done after the indictment was released. And in it, some 76% of Republican primary voters thought that the indictment was politically motivated. So they have failed the test of convincing Americans. That is partly because of the Department of Justice's own history, which is something that I think the prosecutors should have at least acknowledged to themselves as they went down this road, that Americans are already very wary about a politicized Department of Justice, given their own actions in the Russiagate scandal and everything else, and the fact that there seems to be has been in the past a real intent to go after Trump in ways that were not reasonable and were a double standard. I doubt very much that Joe Biden, Merrick Garland, or Jack Smith care much about what this means for the other GOP primary candidates. I think Democrats want Donald Trump to have this issue. They want this to be the focus of the coming campaign. No one is having a conversation about Joe Biden's own record and the economy. And that is what makes me worried too, Paul. You see all of these Republican candidates now trying to make the distinction, coming out to back Trump on the discrete argument about this particular indictment. Then they're going to go out and they're going to try to hit him on other things. But I can promise you that Donald Trump is going to lump every attack together. He is going to say, if you're hitting me on my former tax plans, you're as bad as any Democrat who's going after me because of this Department of Justice issue. And I think it might be difficult for a lot of primary voters to make those distinctions in their head. And that's going to be the real challenge for these other candidates. But this was already going to be a tough race, too. Donald Trump begins as a front runner. There's a lot of other candidates who are splitting the field. And I know this is cynical, but I can't help but think that some Democrats are applauding this indictment purely on those political reasons alone, with no care for what this means for the country going down the road.
Yeah, I don't think you have to be a cynic to conclude that, Kim, at least in my view.
I'm often accused of being a cynic.
No, you're not a cynic. You're a good skeptical reporter, and that always pays to be skeptical politicians. Ron DeSantis, Kyle, already coming out saying, deploring the double standard, and saying he's the man to reform the Justice Department. Vivek Ramaswamy coming out of the gate saying, if I'm elected, I'll pardon Donald Trump. Some of the others, Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson, both critical of the indictment, and Trump more critical. Some of the others also warning about the double standard, Mike Pence, but saying that the indictment and the facts in it trouble them. I agree with Kim. It puts these candidates in a tough position because Trump and his supporters are almost making the argument. They're not explicit about this, but they're almost making the case that an indictment, in fact, is now a credential for running for president, the Republican side, for the nomination, because you must nominate Donald Trump in order to repudiate the tactics of the Biden administration. For me, that's not a good argument, especially since a lot of what Trump did that's in this indictment was brought on by himself and is indicative of how he managed much of his first term, and I think would a second term. But that's going to be a big, powerful argument in the primaries.
But I think you have to look at the facts. I mean, President Trump is now the first president in U.S. history to be indicted twice. And one of those prosecutions looks like it's a stretch of the law. That's the New York one brought by Alvin Bragg. And one of them, at least on the indictment, we haven't seen President Trump's defense here yet, looks to me like there's some strength in it. And it is notable to me, I agree that this puts President Trump's 2024 rivals in a tight spot, but it is notable that some of them seem to be attacking the double standard without defending on the merits Trump's conduct as alleged in this indictment. And so maybe they're giving themselves a little bit of room there for the polls to turn. And I find this pretty unpredictable. I think it's difficult to say how this is going to play out. We may get a third indictment of Donald Trump in Georgia around his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And who knows, we could get into a trial and we could have that audio tape played where President Trump is telling people, I didn't declassify this. Here, take a look at it. And I think that may give voters a visceral reaction in the way that seeing it in print here in the indictment doesn't. And so maybe they're giving themselves a little bit of wiggle room in case GOP voters in 2024 decide that they want to go with somebody else.
Well, they are giving themselves some room here, but the question is, as Kim points out, are the voters going to be willing to hear it? Because it's not the easiest case. I mean, this is a matter of holding two ideas in your head at the same time, right? One is that the Justice Department has overreached here, was imprudent in bringing this indictment with potentially damaging ramifications and intervention in the election campaign. And second, Donald Trump is his own worst enemy, was reckless in his behavior, and brought on a lot of this himself. That's a difficult argument, and certainly in our contentious politics, for a voter to absorb.
Yeah, though Ron DeSantis has already started making that argument, presenting himself as no drama DeSantis, the candidate who you don't have to pay attention to. He just gets up and goes to work and he executes and he gets things done, and he doesn't fire his employees by tweet. There's not constant turnover in his administration. He doesn't do things that are going to get him indicted in federal court. And so we'll have to see whether voters are open to that. But we're still a long, long way from 2024. And so I would not bet on the polling as it is right now with Donald Trump at 50% or more of the vote necessarily sticking. I mean, it could, but we're a long way from the actual ballots being cast.
Kim, the argument that DeSantis is going to have to mount here is essentially, if you really want to reform the Justice Department, you really want to reform the FBI, you've got to nominate and elect somebody who has the competence and discipline to be able to do it, not somebody who's going to be so disorganized, so willful, and so, frankly, dumb and self-destructive that he's going to give his enemies a sword at every opportunity.
He's already started to do that. It was very interesting. He was on Hugh Hewitt, the radio broadcaster, his show earlier today, and spent almost all of it talking about his plan to reconstitutionalize the United States. That's the term he's using, but specifically looking at what he calls the fourth branch, the administrative state, in which he puts people like FBI agents and others that are not political appointees, but who work for the executive branch, and in who Ron DeSantis' argument has way too much autonomy. And what I found really notable about that conversation with Hewitt was the discipline he brought to this argument and the ideas he'd already had for how he was going to make this happen, which came in a whole variety of very innovative ideas, including things like moving more employees outside of Washington, D.C., getting them outside of the capture of the D.C. area, firing people, and then, if necessary, taking that to the Supreme Court to test the limits of an executive's ability to manage the executive branch. On and on. He had a lot of ideas. We can talk about them more in future, but you can make this argument. I guess the question for me is, again, are people going to be listening? I think the more worrisome question, as you mentioned, is whether or not it encourages or inspires them to support him merely as a way of marking their disapproval of the Biden administration. That's the real challenge for the Republican field.
All right, Kim. All right, Kyle. Thank you all especially for listening. We're back every day on Potomac Watch, so please join us tomorrow for another edition. Thanks for listening.